Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here. So we're moving into lecture 14, which is a continuation of the chemical senses. So we just talked about olfaction and taste, which are chemical senses. Now we're going to talk about chemoreceptors, which are kind of for sensing internal chemicals, as well as vomiting and the control of respiration, which also involves some other sensory information. So we're going to start off with chemoreceptors and vomiting. Then we're going to talk about the chemoreceptors that we use for respiration, then the whole respiratory control center mechanism, and then some cases to illustrate how the respiratory center works. So let's start with vomiting. Why not? So chemoreceptors are receptors that detect specific chemicals inside of the body. A chemical is just a molecule, so it can be anything. It can be oxygen, it can be carbon dioxide, it could be ipecac, right? It could be lots of things. And they're really important for homeostasis, as we'll see, right? Control of respiration is part of this lecture. Vomiting can also be very protective. If you have eaten something that is rotten and you vomit it and get it all out of your body, well, that is very protective. So, for vomiting, we have in the medulla, on the floor of the fourth ventricle, an area called the area postrema. So it is located around here. So it's technically in the medulla, and it's kind of right near the fourth ventricle there. And it contains something called the chemoreceptor trigger zone, or CTZ. This is one of several circumventricular organs that we have in the brain. So circumventricular means around the ventricles, right? This one is right near the fourth ventricle. And these are interesting places in our brain where there's no blood-brain barrier. So we have this amazing opportunity to have an interface. You have cells here that are in contact with the CSF and are also in contact with the blood in a way that the rest of the central nervous system is not. So when we learned about the blood-brain barrier, we learned about those really tight junctions between the cells that make up the walls of the capillaries in the CNS, but not in the peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, there's leaky connections. In the area postrema, the CTZ, and in other circumventricular organs, we have those leaky connections in the capillaries, which allows larger molecules to actually come in and be perceived by these cells, these chemoreceptor cells. So this is really useful because you can detect toxic molecules in the CSF and in the blood. So obviously we don't want this everywhere, but where we have chemoreceptors to detect these potential troublemakers, perfect. So that's the area postrema and the chemoreceptor trigger zone, which are located in the medulla. Also in the medulla right next door is the vomiting center. So it's receiving inputs from lots of sources. So one from the chemoreceptor trigger zone in the area postrema, which might be detecting some kind of toxic substance that is in your body that perhaps you've just ingested. So we want to trigger vomiting. It also receives sensory input from cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve that we haven't talked about a lot until now. So we're going to talk about it a lot today. And so that's bringing in sensory input, afferent input from our whole gastrointestinal system. So when I say GI, I mean gastrointestinal system. So that's your whole digestive tract. The vomiting center is also receiving inputs from your vestibular system. So this explains why, if you're motion sick, right, you might be feeling a little nauseated, or you might actually get so severely impacted that you are vomiting. And then, of course, higher central nervous system areas like the cerebral cortex. So if you see something that's really disgusting, or if you smell something that's really disgusting, or if you have a really intense emotional reaction, sometimes that can provoke vomiting. So you have all of these different sensory inputs that are kind of shown here in the diagram that are then bringing signals into the vomiting center in the medulla, and that can trigger the vomiting reflex. And the vomiting reflex is a series of really actually precisely controlled muscular actions that expel the contents of your stomach. So it involves opening the sphincter muscle at the top of the stomach so that the stuff can come out, as well as really forceful contractions of your abdominal muscles and your diaphragm to increase the pressure in the abdomen and push stuff out. Not pleasant, but potentially life-saving. So there we go. Why vomiting if you see something really unsavory or if you have an most intentional response is adaptive to your survival? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it makes an attacking predator think twice. Okay, so in summary for chemoreceptors and vomiting, right? So chemoreceptors are detecting some type of molecule inside of our bodies. We have this CTZ, this trigger zone in the area postrema of the medulla, which is one of those circumventricular organs where there's no blood-brain barrier. So it's really good at being able to detect toxins in both the CSF and in the bloodstream. And so the vomiting center in the medulla oblongata is receiving inputs from the chemoreceptor trigger zone in the area postrema, as well as from your whole intestinal system via the vagus nerve, from your vestibular system via the vestibulocochlear nerve, and from higher CNS brain functions in response to what you're seeing, smelling, thinking, having emotional responses to. And then the output is going to be coordinated signals to the muscles that will make you vomit. All right, that's it for 14A. We'll talk about chemoreceptors that are used by the respiratory system next.